Yesterday, when last we met, we were looking at the land of Canaan and it talked about some of the different tribes that lived there. And then we specifically centered in on the Phoenicians. We learned where they lived. We learned that their primary occupation was what?
Trade.
What was that?
Trade.
Trade. Yeah, and what mode? How? Where? On the ocean, or mostly the Mediterranean Sea. So they used ships, boats, to trade. And we talked about some of the things that they traded. Do you remember what were the two natural products that they traded, that they were known for? Give me one, Amelia, without looking. Okay, timber or lumber. What's another one, Stephen?
Purple dye.
Right, purple dye. Good. And then we also saw that they traded in glass, which was made from the white sand. They had three different kinds of glass: transparent, colorless, semi-transparent, colored, and then opaque, which you can't see through, with lots of colors. And then the last thing that they traded, I'm not sure that we got to, and that is papyrus. And from where would they get papyrus? Where would they get papyrus? Where? Egypt, yes. And then they would take the papyrus up to the city of Byblos, and there there were scribes that would write on the papyrus and write books. And the word Byblos then came to be used for a book. And eventually it became our word for our book. Byblos becomes the Bible. So Bible simply means book. Now the other thing that the Phoenicians are credited with is originating what becomes our alphabet. Now if you look at this, you can see the hieroglyphic script and a description of it. So that's an ox head, that's a house, that's a fish, man praying, and so on. Look down through there, you can see what those are. The Hebrew name for these letters is given here, and you're familiar with these from our reading in Psalm 119. Aleph, Beit, Dalet, He, He, Kaf, Lamed, Mem, Nun, He, Resh, Shin, Tau. That's not all the letters, but that's the majority of them. And then the Phoenicians took these ideas and made them into a script, so that it's not picture writing anymore, but they took the picture and made it into something that was more of a symbol. And then Old Greek kind of borrowed from them. You can see the progression from here to here, from there to there. And here are the names of the Greek letters: alpha, beta, delta, epsilon, eta, kappa, lambda, mu, nu, pi or p, rho, sigma, tau. You can see that there's some similarity between the Hebrew names and the Greek names, and there's been a progression from the original picture writing to the Phoenician script, and then gets into Greek, and then Latin is more the letters that we use, and you can see them listed here. But here's where they came from originally. Right, so there's a connection there. So the Phoenicians are given credit for having brought the picture writing into a script that became letters and not just pictures. All right, and so many would say that our alphabet is based on the Phoenicians. So they get credit for creating our alphabet. All right, any questions about that? Okay, let's briefly look at the religion of the Phoenicians. Now they had a god for each city, as most people did, and then they had one god that was for a city in general. They had a goddess of fertility, which is most most civilizations had. They had a young god that appealed to people. So you have the god of the city, goddess of fertility, and a young god. And here are some of the names of gods. You've got Baal Haman. Baal becomes the name for God, or maybe even you could say a generic name for God, just like our word God. Our word God doesn't signify anyone in particular necessarily, and Baal is like that. It can be translated Lord, and then you usually have another name after it. And so that becomes common throughout the land of Canaan, Phoenicia as well. We have Astarte, who is the same as the goddess Ishtar that we've seen before. We have Melkart, and then here's a picture of a young girl bringing a flower offering. Here's the priest in the stone altar, and you can see there's a sheep on there. So their religion was similar to any other religion that might be around. Now, next we want to understand the primary city. The primary city of Phoenicia is Tyre. Sidon is also important, and Byblos up here too. But Tyre is the main city. Tyre and Sidon were the high-traffic port cities. They're only about 20 miles apart. And the greatest influence that the Phoenicians had was during the time of Solomon. So when you think about King Solomon, you think the Phoenicians were at their height. That's when they were doing the most trading and sailing into parts unknown. We don't know how far they went. All right, that's the Phoenicians. Any questions about the Phoenicians? Just remember that they were important for trade, sailing on the Mediterranean Sea in particular, and know the important things that they did trade, the most important ones. And their cities, Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos. Okay, next let's move to the Arameans. Arameans, or sometimes called Syrians. One of the most important civilizations that evolved in the early Middle East was that of the Arameans. And known for their brutality and military conquests, the Arameans were eventually able to take control over the territories between Egypt and Mesopotamia. So you can see here, Egypt would be down this way, Mesopotamia over here. The Arameans controlled much of the territory in between. By around 1200 BC, they had the control over this area. And because of the nature of the land, this also meant that they controlled the trade routes that went through this area. Because you can't go from Egypt straight across here. Why? Why can't you go from Egypt straight across over to Mesopotamia, to Babylon? Because it's all desert. You don't travel through there. So in order to go there, you've got to go up around. And so that's where the trade routes went. There was a road that went down along the coast, another road that went along here, and several roads that went back and forth. So the Arameans control the area where most of the trade is taking place in that part of the world. And so that allowed them to profit greatly because they have control over who goes in and out. And of course, they exact some tolls, some taxes on those that come through. It also meant that the people in other regions, if they wanted to be able to communicate with the Arameans as they're controlling trade, they needed to learn their language. And so the Aramean language became the dominant language in that part of the world, from Egypt all the way over to Mesopotamia. The Aramean language is similar to Hebrew and Arabic. And eventually, it becomes the language of the people of Jesus' time, too. Then it's called Aramaic, but it comes from the Arameans. So for many centuries, people in that region would continue to speak Aramean in their language. In fact, there are some portions of the Bible that were written in Aramaic, which is a development from Aramaic. It's similar to Hebrew, and there are portions of the Hebrew Bible that are written in Aramaic. And as I said, that's the language that Jesus and his disciples and the people living in Judea, Galilee spoke at their time. That was their common language. All right, and it comes from these guys. So they had a big effect on culture, especially language. And here's a carving made of the Arameans. You can see they're on horseback. They have chariots, indicating their warlike nature. All right, any questions about the Arameans? Okay, now let's go to the people that we've been studying from off and on, and but these are people that inhabit the land, and those are the Hebrews. The Hebrew people. Begins with Abram or Abraham, who came from what city? Ur, right. So he is Abraham of Ur, and of course he came over to the land of Canaan, lived there for some time, went down to Egypt and back up. Then he had a child by the name of Isaac. Isaac had two sons who were, right? And which one was the one who was to carry on the spiritual line to receive the blessing? Jacob, right. And Jacob had how many sons? 12, which become the 12 tribes of Israel, right? And Jacob's name was changed, in fact, to Israel. So that's why they call it the 12 tribes of Israel. The 12 tribes of Israel end up going down to Egypt because which son had gone down to Egypt? He was down there on vacation, is that right? He was enslaved, and he eventually became the what? Vizier. Okay, very good, John. John's giving me answers here. Of Egypt, and all of his family were down in Egypt. And then about how long were the Israelites in Egypt? They liked it so much they stayed for a long time. 400 years, approximately. And what were they doing most of that time? Or a large part of that time, I wouldn't say most. A large part of that time, what were they doing? Being slaves, yeah. And then eventually, who leads them out? Moses. So they were in bondage in Egypt. Moses led them out, and we have that reflected here. They come through the Red Sea. Moses receives the 10 Commandments where? On Sinai. Good. And then from there, at Mount Sinai, God gives Moses specific details as to how they are to worship Him, and the construction of the tabernacle or the tent of meeting, sometimes called, and that establishes a rule of government for Israel that we call a theocracy. A theocracy is ruled by God. God was their ruler, and so He gave them particular guidelines as to what they were to do. This reflects some of that. One of the things, and of course, here's the name Yahweh. He is that's the name of God who established covenant relationship with the Israelites. He told them to construct the Ark of the Covenant, and on top of the Ark of the Covenant is the mercy seat with 2 cherubim that are protecting the mercy seat. What are the poles for? To carry it. Okay, why? Why do they need poles?
When they're traveling.
Yeah. What, Griff?
Because you die.
You touch it, you die. Yeah. That's short and simple. All right. What's inside the Ark of the Covenant? Does anybody know? 3 things inside the Ark of the Covenant. The most important thing that God gave them. The 10 Commandments are in there on stone. Let's see. The other one would be an indication that God was with Moses and Aaron. That they were His chosen ones to lead the Israelites. No? That would be a good idea, but not it.
Was it the staff?
Of
Moses' staff?
Not Moses' staff, it was Aaron's. And there was the one time when God made it actually bud. It grew buds on it, even though it had been a stick for a long time, to show the people that Aaron was had the authority of God. That was in there. And then something else that indicated how God provided for the Israelites when they were traveling. What did God give them to eat for a long time? Manna. There's a pot of manna in there as well. All right? So those things are inside. That was an indication of the presence of God. And inside the tabernacle, where did that go? In the way back. Like the trunk of a car?
No.
What do you mean? Anybody know? What was the innermost room? The Holy of Holies. Good. It was in the Holy of Holies. And how many people could go in there? What?
The priest.
The priest? What do you mean, the priest? What's he mean?
Wasn't it Moses and Aaron?
Nope. Not Moses.
High priest.
The high priest. Aaron was the high priest, the first one. So the high priest could go in there. Would you go in every day?
No, once a year.
Once a year. I think it would be awful dusty, wouldn't it? Only going in once a year. But that's right. Anybody know the name of the day in which Aaron or the high priest would go in to the Ark of the Covenant in the Holy of Holies? What's that day called? It's called Yom Kippur, which means
Day of Atonement.
yes, Day of Atonement. Good. All right, so that's an important part of the Hebrew religion, as you might call it. As time goes on, God sends prophets. What's a prophet?
Speaks prophecy.
Okay, what does that mean if they speak prophecy?
They tell you what's coming.
They might tell you what's coming. What else might they tell you? Is prophecy just what's coming in the future?
What's happening now.
Could be what's happening now. This prophecy simply means communication from God. Sometimes it's about the future, but sometimes not. So a prophet is someone who communicates for God. God tells them what to say, and they say it. So there were prophets throughout the years. Now, this particular picture shows these people as being Jews, and that's not correct. That's an anachronism. You know what an anachronism is? It's when you apply a word today to something in the past that didn't exist back then. Shakespeare has some anachronisms. He has some things in his plays that weren't invented yet. Joseph Smith did the same thing in the Book of Mormon. There are things there that weren't around yet. All right, so there were no Jews. Why? Because they weren't called that until after the Babylonian exile, which was primarily people from Judah, and so they called them Jews. Here, they should be called Hebrews or Israelites, either one of those. Okay, what is this? Menorah. What is that?
The golden lampstand.
It's the golden lampstand, right? And that was to burn all time. It wasn't candles, it was oil that came up through here. And we're going to see the importance of the menorah later on. Dead Sea Scroll is not something from ancient Hebrew times. This is something that was written. These are copies of the Old Testament scripture that were written down. Maybe 100 or 200 years before Christ. But the importance we've already seen in Bible class, right? That the Dead Sea Scrolls, remember, were 1,000 years separated from the most recent manuscripts that we had before, and yet they're almost identical to what we had. And almost the entire Old Testament is on the Dead Sea Scrolls. So those are some important aspects of the Hebrew religion. Now let's talk about the situation when the Israelites come into the land of Canaan. At the time, the land of Canaan was a province of Egypt. Egypt had reached all the way up into Canaan, and they organized the land into a city-state system. So they had cities, fortified cities here and there throughout the land, and each city governed their own affairs. But Egypt was in charge. That simply meant that they sent tribute to Egypt, and Egypt would offer protection if The larger cities were ruled by a native king, that's someone who was from there, who paid tribute. As I said, the cities were well fortified. There was military power there that was enlarged by the local princes with chariots, with chariotry, and foot soldiers. They used the common people as foot soldiers. So that's the situation when the children of Israel come into the land of Canaan. Now, there had been a decline in Canaanite civilization from 1500 to 1300 BC, and in part because Egypt was in control. Because Egypt brought heavy taxation and corrupt administration of Egypt. So the government of Egypt was not good for the land of Canaan. I think I've told you before, they essentially were looking at ways to get from Canaan. They weren't looking to develop it. So heavy taxes, corrupt administration. Socially, there was no middle class. So there was either the wealthy who owned the land and were in control, and the poor. And that works against the development of crafts and guilds, and therefore against the progress of civilization. Civilization can't advance if there are not people who have the leisure to create things. And under the Egyptian rule, there was no such thing. The Canaanite religion was a religion that was very debased as well. Okay, I think I need to go to the next slide here. Yeah, this is a message that we talked about before from the Canaanites to Egypt, saying that the Hebrew are now attempting to take Jerusalem. And that would be the Hebrew people. Okay, next, what I just told you. So I did not go ahead where I should have. Heavy taxation, corrupt administration, no middle class, which worked against the development of civilization, essentially. Next, we're going to look at the low level of Canaanite religion. Okay, so we caught up. Some people are still writing. We'll give you a minute. All right. It may be stated without exaggeration that the Canaanite religion was the most sexually perverted, morally depraved, and bloodthirsty of all ancient history. It was for this reason that God ordered Joshua to exterminate their very culture, citizens, and cities. Some people look at the Old Testament, and especially where God tells the Israelites to go into the land of Canaan and kill everybody and every living thing, every animal, sometimes. And they say, what an awful God. You know, that's terrible that God would do that. If you understand what the religion was of these people, then you'll understand why God said to do that. Their religion included human sacrifice, sacred prostitution, that is a part of their worship was having sex with prostitutes. They had eunuch priests, that is priests that were castrated. They had serpent priests that handled snakes. And they had a brutal mythology. The stories of their gods was brutal, which will explain why their worship was also brutal. Now we're going to talk about some of their gods. First we have the head god, who is El. Now that's very similar and the same abbreviation for the God of the Hebrews, whose name is Elohim. Sometimes he's called El. So El is simply a generic name for God. And that's what they called their head god, El. His wife was Asherah. Pictured here and here. Here's Asherah. And he had a son named Baal. Oh, I'm sorry, this is Baal down here. That's Asherah, and that's Baal. Or some people say Baal. I think Baal is probably closer. And they had a daughter named Anat, or Anat. El also married his three sisters, one of whom was Astarte. El had 70 children, the most famous being Baal. El killed his brother and some of his own sons. He then cut off his daughter's head, castrated his father, castrated himself, and compelled his confederates to do the same. So they had a big castration party. Which would not, just say ouch. Yeah. Not something you want to think about. The sister of Baal was Anat, as we said, and she became the vile and vicious goddess of passion, war, and violence. And according to mythology, she fought Baal's enemies. She was the fighter. The Baal epic of Ugarit depicts her as follows. With her might, she mowed down the dwellers of the cities. She struck down the people of the seacoasts. She destroyed the men of the east. She drove men into her temple and closed the doors so that no one could escape. She hurled chairs at the youths, tables at the warriors, footstools at the mighty men. She waded up to the knees, up to the neck in blood. Human heads lay at her feet. Human hands flew over her like locusts. She tied the heads of her victims as ornaments upon her back. Their hands she tied upon her belt. Her liver was swollen with laughing. Her heart was full of joy. When she was satisfied, she washed her hands in streams of human blood before turning again to other things. She was called the Holy One. But she was sadistic, a sex goddess, and a prostitute. She seems nice. That's who they're worshiping. You see why God said, we got to wipe those people out. The name Baal can be translated as Lord, and it's the title given to the storm god Hadad. So really his name is Baal Hadad. Pictured here. Since Baal brought rain, he was the storm god, he was also credited with bringing the annual crops which were dependent on the rain. In the Ugaritic myths, Baal is portrayed as a mighty, lustful, and ambitious deity, but also as a god with decidedly more muscles than brains. His worshippers clearly enjoyed a good story about Baal charging into a situation through sheer bravado, only to discover too late that it was really a dumb thing to do. Baal relied primarily on his sister Anat to rescue him from these difficulties of his own making, though others, such as Kothar and Hassus, who was a skilled artisan deity, Shapshu, the sun goddess, Asherah, and El, the parent gods, rulers of the pantheon, helped him as well. So Baal is the storm god, and we come across him quite often in the Old Testament, and especially we find him in the event that we have when Elijah battles against the prophets of Baal. Are you familiar with that event? He has a contest with the prophets of Baal. And he tells the people of Israel have been worshiping Baal because of the influence of the wicked queen Jezebel. Remember her? Who was married to King Ahab. And God had brought a drought for 3.5 years on Israel to bring Ahab to repentance. He just saw that as Elijah's fault. But Elijah says, I challenge you to a duel. You bring up your prophets and I'll come up on top of Mount Carmel. And the 400 prophets of Baal are there. And Elijah says, you go first. Whichever God can send down fire and start a fire on the sacrifice, that will be the true God. Now, for the prophets of Baal, they're saying, that should be easy peasy, because our God is the God of the storm. He's the one that sends lightning. So that should be no sweat for Baal to do this. Didn't Elijah know that we have the storm god on our side? We got this in the bag. So what do? They have a sacrifice there. and they're crying out to their God, and nothing's happening. All day long, they're crying out to him. Elijah's mocking them. He says things like, well, maybe he can't hear you. You know, try harder. Oh, maybe he is off relieving himself. Maybe that's why he's not acting. You know, he's making fun of Baal because kind of that's what people did. Baal did stupid things, but he is a mighty God. So they're calling him. They cut themselves. They're doing all kinds of things. Nothing works. Finally, Elijah says, "Now it's my turn." And remember, he had a servant bring water and dig a trench around the altar and pour water on top of it. Wait a minute, if you're starting a fire, what's the one thing you don't want to do? Put water on it. He puts water on top of it, fills the trench with water. There's water all over the whole thing. And what happens?
It scorches the water.
God sends fire down, and it not only starts a fire, but laps up all the water as well. And the people say, Yahweh is God, not Baal. And then Elijah kills 400 prophets right there. And we won't go to the rest of the story. There's a lot more that happens, but interesting stuff there in 1 Kings. All right. Now, I want to mention then one thing about the fact that the Israelites are invading Canaan. And that is the real purpose of the theology of the conquest. And that is the fact that they are destroying everything that they find in there, is to preserve the revelation given to Israel. The real purpose is to preserve what God has given them. Because if they go into the land and they are living with these people, they're going to be corrupted by these people. And that's demonstrated later on when Jezebel brings Baal worship into Israel. So the real purpose is to preserve the revelation that God has given them. And it's also for the good of the nations of the world, secondly, because the religion of the Canaanites was the most debased religion in the world. It was to protect the other nations from this spreading to them. So there were good reasons for God to tell the Israelites, look, you need to just wipe those people out. Oops, I forgot to put those up there for you. There you go. And one more thing to understand is, and that is that a holy war like this was not unique to Israel. Other nations often fought on behalf of their God to destroy others. But this had some good reason behind it. Okay, tomorrow we'll talk about the advantages of the Canaanites as the Israelites are coming into the land, and what transpires as they come in and try to establish themselves in the land of Canaan. For tomorrow, with that in mind, I want you to read the book of Judges. What, the whole book? Yeah, well, you don't have to read for detail, but read through it, get an idea, because have any of you ever read the book of Judges? You've probably read parts of it, you've heard parts of it, so this will give you a good overview of the whole thing, and you can see maybe some of the themes that are there. Okay, so read through the book of Judges. Again, I don't want you to take hours on this. If you spend more than a half hour, 40 minutes, you're reading too carefully, all right? Write down a few of the major things that you come across. All right, the book of Judges for tomorrow, and then we'll talk about Judges as well. Any questions?